Welcome out today. We are on the fourth week of the legislative session. And so I think we're down to, this is the beginning of the fourth week, but once this week's done, I think we're down to just 2 or 3 weeks left. So things are coming down. There's going to be a lot more pressure, I think, on committees and things to get things through. And there's still bills coming out, some interesting ones. So to start out, does anyone have a bill that they want to discuss or talk about, or an issue that maybe's been in the news? And if not, that's great. I'll go to one that just came out. I don't even think this one was out yesterday when we met. But this is one that concerns me. Watching the legislature do things. It's always funny to see what they do. When people push back on something, they like to push back as well. So we have HB 422. That's called Initiative Amendments. And they want to. So I don't know if you remember when Utah tried to put sales tax on services, and it was very unpopular. They still passed it, despite most of Utah telling them no. And so there was a ballot initiative by citizens where they signed a petition to say that they wanted to force the law to go on the ballot. So they got enough signatures on that. Harmon's jumped in and helped with that, let people come collect signatures at Harmon's locations. And once they got enough signatures to put it on the ballot, Utah repealed the law. They decided they didn't want to submit it to the ballot and see what happened. Oh, it looks like in response to that, they're a little bit put out that people can overturn their will. So they're proposing this amendment to say that if we've increased taxes, then you have to get 60% of voters in the actual election. So again, the process is you get signatures, it gets put on the ballot to vote on, and then instead of the normal 50%, which is what it was before, just if yes is greater than no, it only passes, or it's only rejected by voters if more than 60% vote. I'm sure they'll say things like, oh, this is necessary because tax increases are never popular. And so if it's just a popularity contest, we'll never be able to increase taxes. But I still have high concerns with this because this is taking away our checks and balances on the government to be able to push back when they pass tax legislation. And to be clear, it's not easy to get enough signatures to put it on the ballot in the first place. Utah's increased taxes plenty of times and not had to go to referendum by the voters. But when they proposed a whole new tax system on services and proposed to increase other taxes and do different things, Utahns are pretty upset with that. So this is one I'd recommend reaching out, just personally, voting no on, just from a sheer perspective of, I don't think it's good for what the future holds if the legislature wants to take away our ability to have a say in taxes. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that, but that is one to give you some notice of.
This is, it's interesting they're doing this, especially in a state that has huge surpluses every year. And they're concerned that they can't get enough tax increases. I don't understand what's even going on here.
Yeah, we do have a lot of surpluses. It's kind of crazy how much money they have to play with up there. But on the flip side of that bill, there's a good one to note, which is HB 372. And to give a little background on HB 372, the Utah Constitution requires that citizens have the right to overturn legislation that's passed if they can get enough signatures. The Constitution didn't specify the number of signatures or the exact manner. They left that to legislation. But they recently joined school district had a tax increase. This was last year that was very unpopular. And there was a group that tried to do a referendum on the property tax increase. But in an amendment a number of years ago, school districts were removed from the referendum legislation. So the law didn't specifically include school districts. The group filed an appeal to the Utah Supreme Court, and the Utah Supreme Court looked at it and said, yeah, the law doesn't cover it. There's a hole in it. That's a big issue, but we don't really know what to do about it in this quick of a time frame. And so the Supreme Court didn't act on it. But HB 372 is trying to fill in that hole. So that's one where people are actually being given more voting power over property taxes, because it's including school districts in that provision to make them subject to local referendum as well. So if they pass substantial property tax increases, then the citizens within that school district would have the ability to gather petitions and force it to a vote on the ballot if it was too high or too much of one. So that's one to look at in conjunction with this, where there's the two different ones that work. To know that on one hand, there's a bill to give citizens a little more say in taxes. And on one hand, there's a bill to decrease that say. And it's possible both pass and both, go in conjunction together. But again, I'd personally recommend letting your reps know that HB 372 is a really important provision, fills in some important gaps in state law, and that HB 422 is a really bad idea. I'm sure that they know we'll all dislike it, so I'm not entirely sure how to stop HB 422. But I think we should definitely call it our reps for trying to take away our voice there. Are there any questions though, or more comments on the tax referendum bills that are in place? All right, well, we will go to.
Sorry, Austin, I guess, like you said the other day, there's really no way to know who is pushing these bills. Is that right?
Correct.
Other than the bill sponsor, but.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a bill I'd still be pretty interested in. Again, on the campaign finance side of things, we force disclosure of anyone that donates to a candidate for election. And I'm not sure why we don't require disclosure of the groups behind bills, the ones that reach out to the reps about it. And so that's one thing that I think we as citizens could really start to push, is to say to some reps, hey, we want this to be a thing. We want to know who the groups are behind this, who the interests are that are pushing for this law, because it gives us some insight into what they may be planning or thinking with it. Because most bills aren't proposed just spur of the moment. Most come through thought, process, a lot of work beforehand. And people usually have a reason they're looking for that. Today, for example, in a committee hearing, one of the senators asked the sponsoring, the sponsor for the legislation, the senator that sponsored it. She asked him why, what the genesis was for it, what the reason was, or what had resulted in the thought behind the bill, because she was trying to make sure she understood whether the intentions were good or whether the intentions were a little nefarious. There were some groups that were saying it could have some bigger impacts. And that was one thing they checked, but they didn't ask who the sponsors were behind it or who the groups were behind it. They just stopped at asking the senator himself why. But it does provide insight, is the point, I think, with that. So again, if there's a place you want to have some ability to help shine the light on things, I'm a strong believer that light's a good thing and really helps us understand more what's going on. But we have, and again, feel free to jump in at any time if you have legislation you want to talk about. If there's an issue that you want to go through, we're happy to do that. Just jump in or throw that in on chat. But one, I've always been interested because I saw this in Michigan, and we haven't had it here in Utah yet. But this bill proposes to put a moratorium in place for shutting off people's utilities. So if you get behind on utilities and don't pay, then they are proposing that the utility services not be allowed to shut off services when the 5-day forecast shows a forecast of 90, something greater than 90 degrees or something less than 32 degrees. And so that's a question to you of, what are your thoughts on that kind of legislation? Is that a good thing, a bad thing to say to utility companies, hey, don't shut off power or gas if it's below 32 degrees or above 90 degrees? Curious to hear any thoughts on that with SB 190.
I'm not understanding this. Do they, so the day they go to turn off their utilities, if the next 5 days is bad weather, they don't? What
Yeah,
about
they
the
can't
next
do it.
what about the next 10 days, the next 12 days? I mean, they're 5 days is, I mean, this doesn't seem like it might help for a moment, but what does it do for the long term? Does it even make a difference?
A difference in what way?
I'm just saying, say you turn off their gas and the next 5 days, it's not going to be in these temperatures, but then on the 6th day it is. So what they're trying to prevent only works for 5 days around the time they shut off their utilities. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think what the theory is that they, when your utilities get shut off, you usually figure out how to get them back on within 2 or 3 days. Most people don't go for more than 5 days without utilities. But yeah, but it's possible that you shut it off and then the person has 5 days to figure it out. And then I guess if they don't, then, there could be the freezing temperatures or the super high temperatures. But it was certainly something in Michigan. They just had a ban during the winter. You couldn't turn off gas or electricity because there would often be stories about people that froze to death or something if utilities were turned off. Most of the time it was elderly people that could have those issues. I noticed they also have issues about if they disconnect power and someone is on oxygen. There's a number of states that want more notice there for those types of people. So just curious if anyone thinks it's a good thing, bad thing, kind of indifferent.
Hey, Austin.
Yep.
Question. So, do they have, they stipulate how they will let the people know that they have 5 days? When we moved in to our home, I don't remember why it happened, but there was a problem with the gas, like getting set up or whatever. They just left a hanger on my doorknob saying, you don't pay this, we're gonna shut it down, which we had already paid. I mean, it was a mix up and whatever, but I just think if you have 5 days and you don't realize you haven't made your bill and they start counting 5 days for you, how do you know? I mean, how's that gonna help you know you've got so much time to get it set? If it doesn't go off, that's obviously not, you don't have a warning.
Yeah, so the 5 days, what the 5 days is, it's not 5 days notice to you necessarily. It's that if they look at the weather and the forecast says within the next 5 days it will be 32 degrees or less or 90 degrees or higher, they can't shut off your utilities. So even if they said, hey, we're going to shut off your utilities, but then they go to do it and the next 5-day forecast shows that there's 32 degrees or 90 degrees, they're not going to shut it off. They have to wait until the 5-day forecast shows 5 days above 32 or below 90 before they can shut it off.
So it could last a while then, in theory.
It could last quite a while that they have a moratorium. And so yes, again, in Michigan, sometimes it could go for up to 6 months that they couldn't shut off utilities. And so I think to me with something like this, I always struggle with giving people free rent or free utilities for too long because it can be abused pretty easily. I think my personal vote would be to say, hey, if we're in periods of severe weather or middle of summer, winter, maybe we increase the notice period. You know, that, hey, you got 2 weeks to figure things out. They're going to be shut off. But I kind of feel that if you've provided sufficient notice, I don't know why we'd have a moratorium on it necessarily. But again, it's something I can see that we'd say, well, there's elderly people or something. And I don't think elderly people generally try and abuse the system or just run, you know, with not paying. But I certainly see that as an attorney. I have clients who get renters or others that just jump in and do things and they know the system and the loopholes. But again, this is a protection that's in place in a lot of states. It's not something new, but I have always been interested that it wasn't in Utah yet. So one to be aware of there. Here's one that I like to talk about. Anyways, it's a fun issue. I just had this thought just the other day with where I live, went to get on the freeway and there's still campaign signs out. And I remember thinking, I wonder if they ever go back through and find the officials if their campaign signs are left up, if they don't go clean them all up. Because there's still quite a few out and we're 3 months out from the election or something. And so this is a bill that is proposing to require that if you put out a campaign sign, you have to identify the owner of the sign, have an address on it for the owner, and if the state traffic, what do they call themselves, Department of Transportation, removes the sign, then they can charge them $15 per sign they take down. And so I think some people might say that this violates freedom of speech to require to identify owners and those speaking. But curious if you think this is a good idea, bad idea, or just one of those where it's like, who really cares?
What bill number is this, bud?
This one's SB 181.
I've often thought that I wish they'd clean up their signs after their elections are. They seem to hang around places, especially when it's not on private property where it's just nailed to posts and different things. I think it's I'd be grateful if they could figure out a way to get those cleaned up.
Yeah, one thing I did look for in here is I thought, well, what if someone doesn't put their ownership on there? I didn't see a penalty for putting up a sign without ownership.
How are you supposed to put like your name and address on the sign?
Yeah, so the owner. So usually what the owner means is you either have an election fund, the committee to elect John Smith, and then they can put their address, which could be a PO box.
I see.
But it's a place where they can mail you a bill for cleaning up your signs.
Okay. I don't know. I don't know.
Actually, I think I'd go put up a bunch of signs from somebody I didn't like without any name on it.
Yeah,
Or you put a name on it and just put someone
Yeah.
else's name and address, right? And again,
Yeah.
there's no penalty for that in here, so.
I think that's fraught with problems.
Yeah, it could be.
You know, our elections are a system that our government, you know, I think that's just probably an irritating aspect that the government has to deal with. You know, I don't know. I think that could just be a whole can of worms that is unnecessary.
Yeah, it's interesting because to the point of, well, could I get crafty and just start putting out signs for somebody I don't like and leaving them up? And under freedom of speech grounds, you know, do I have the right to leave signs up even if I'm no longer running? All these things. I think there's a number of issues that could pop up in something like this. So I think it's a well-intentioned thing to say, hey, poor government's stuck cleaning these things up when the candidates don't do a good job. And so what exactly do you do? And again, I don't entirely know the answer to that, but fun one to look at because campaign signs do get a little out of hand. I love seeing corners where there's 20 of each sign. They're trying to have more than the other person. And but again, like you say, it's part of our landscape here. Who knows how this will go? Brian did ask, I missed this chat, but Brian did ask results I saw from the legislation in Michigan with the moratorium on utility shutoffs. And I'd say that the main thing was, well, Michigan had two things combined. They had the utility one. They also had extreme procedures for eviction. And so they protected a lot of tenants' rights and situations. So I never saw a utility one independent of an eviction as well. But I clerked for a judge and there was a house where I think the rent on it back in 2007 was $4,500 a month. It was a very big home. And these tenants move in and immediately they stop paying because under Michigan law, at a minimum, you have 9 months to get evicted. And at the end of the 9 months, the one of the tenants said that his spouse had moved in or something and wasn't given proper notice, and so they had to restart the whole process over again. And I remember sitting there and this, you know, going through the case history, it became apparent that these people just did this. That was their MO for hopping from place to place and doing things. They weren't paying utilities. They weren't doing any of these things. And the judge was so upset. You know, he just came in. I was his clerk, and I guess this was in 2008. And he said, Austin, he said, you just figure any reason we can to get these people out. Just want them gone. He goes, they're, you know, playing these loopholes in the law. I can't stand people like this. He says, I see it all too often. And so what happens generally from what I see, if the protections are too broad, people do start to use them or abuse them. You know, you can start to use your utility company as a loan essentially during the winter months. You just stop paying. No, you can't get evicted. And then you can use cash for other things. And there's quite a bit of America that lives on payday loans. And so generally, utilities and phone are some of the things that get paid first by people, because when there's a very high rate of disconnect and you lose that connection and it's immediate, people tend to get those bills paid. And so I was talking to an eviction attorney here in Utah. Utah has very fast eviction procedures. You know, they can tell you to be out in 3 days. They can get a court to have a hearing very quickly and kick you out if you're not paying. And he claimed that he has a practice in Utah that does evictions and a practice in Arizona that does evictions. And Arizona has more protections for tenants. But he claims that the default rate for tenants is way lower. The eviction rate in Utah is way lower because people know that they either have to come up with the money or they need to move out. And most elect to voluntarily move out and not cause too many issues for the landlord. But in states where there's more protections put in place, you tend to have more and more abuses come into the system, was his opinion. But I certainly saw in Michigan quite a few abuses related to tenant and housing. But again, I couldn't comment if those were separate from a compounding effect from their tenant laws they had, or if it was just related to the utility shutoffs. But even with the utility shutoffs, you'd still see news sometimes of an old guy that froze to death. You know, again, sad thing. They just get too old to understand everything that's going on. But again, I don't fully know if it protects them or not if we shut it off during the winter, just because, you know, we'll sometimes have weeks that are in the 40s for 5 days, so they could shut it off during that time. And if it goes back to 32 degrees, I don't know if that person's really protected or not, but
I don't know that we can govern by every possible scenario that could go wrong. You know, I mean, it just seems like you have to navigate things for the general population that, you know, is functioning. I mean, clearly if an elderly person died or froze to death, they probably should have been in a care center and just, you know, I mean, that was a slip through the cracks for that family or whatever. But it just seems like we're trying to eradicate every possible scenario that could go wrong in society, and we're just micromanaging everything.
yeah, and there is certainly society, I think, is becoming more and more concerned about the harms. Because again, when we hear about things in the news, it's very quick, very instant. We can hear about a poor old guy that freezes to death. That's a very sad thing. But like you say, can law fully fix all that? Can it not? You know, it's questionable. But with things like utilities generally are quasi-public. They're under heavy government regulation and control. Anyways, so it's not purely like a private market, you know, like we shut off your phone. And so should there be maybe some protections because we become so reliant on them? Again, the one I think I have some sympathy for, especially is when people are on machines that help keep them alive in their homes, whether it be breathing or other things like that. That's an increasing thing happening in society. And so again, yes, I agree, we can't legislate against all harms. I haven't personally heard of a situation in Utah where someone froze to death here. But I think they're recognizing more and more that as society ages, as more people don't have children, it's going to be an increasing problem that increases more and more. And then again, is it a horrible thing to say, well, if it's too cold outside, just wait, you know, the utility companies can wait a little while. That's a balance I'm not sure is the worst thing in the world. But I think I'm generally a fan of give them plenty of notice of when it will happen. And then, you know, even if it's noticed, to make sure, you know, even if someone could register and say, hey, I'm old, I need you to actually knock on my door and talk to me or something like that. Those might be things, but again, maybe that's too much to carry out. Maybe this is easier. So maybe it's a good solution. But it is one that's always interesting as we start to push rights to people to say, hey, you have a right to power, you have a right to water, you have a right to different things. It starts to create potential precedent for other things as well. So,
this is Rich. I see that, like, again, like you said, for those bills that are shut off very quickly, people usually find a way to take care of it. And I think, yeah, we need to craft laws that maybe protect people, but also still foster responsibility. And yeah, I like your idea of like either having like a longer grace period or something rather than a total moratorium just for the temperatures. Same with the campaign sign, just take your sign down. Like, I don't need the law to tell people to take their signs down. Just, yeah, it should just be an expectation. I know people don't always do it, but yeah.
Well, and to be fair, I mean, if you're running an election, generally what happens is you print a bunch of signs, you give them to 100 volunteers, and your volunteers go everywhere and put them up. And then win or lose after the election, the volunteers don't have a whole lot of incentive to go pull down every sign they put up.
I see.
And you
Yeah.
have no
Oh.
idea where those went to.
Yeah.
As a rep. I mean, your volunteers could have even put them outside your district. You have no idea. And so that is one where I have some sympathy for the people, because I look at it, I'll see a sign when I'm out driving, and then I think, what if that candidate has never driven on this road? Because they may not have a reason to drive on this road. Yeah, just something there that is difficult, because most campaigns are run by volunteers. The people go a little crazy, put things wherever.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, but yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I guess I agree with you. I don't know that we should fine people for leaving the sign up. Just have an expectation that we take care of our trash and leave it at that.
Yeah. Maria?
I'm just curious to get your take on HB 101.
HB
Yes.
101, going back to the beginning. Yeah.
Did that, my phone, it's not bringing it up. Is it, did it die? I mean, what are the chances of this making it?
To remove the sales tax on food.
Yeah.
Let's see the status. So it's still sitting in Rules Committee for a very long time.
What does that mean?
So what that means is that it's not a popular bill, is what it means.
Okay.
House Rules Committee is the first, so every bill goes through Rules. And what Rules gets to do, they're considered one of the more powerful committees. They assign the bill to another committee that actually hears it and votes on it. And so they get to make the decision about which, where it goes, what happens. And that alone can often determine the fate or life of a bill. So if they really don't like it, they'll send it to a committee that will kill it. Based on its composition. They know the makeup and composition of how people vote in the committees. And so it's still sitting in House Rules since January 17th, which is quite a while since the start of the session to be sitting there.
Yeah.
And it definitely means that Rules doesn't care a whole lot about it
Okay.
to send it out.
So what do we, I mean, with inflation, people are having to cut back on their lifestyle because everything's getting so expensive. It seems like the government should be somehow doing the same and at least trying to make some effort to show acknowledgement of that, and maybe, tightening their strap a little bit. It doesn't seem like there's really any acknowledgement of that, or, I mean, this inflation has been going up for quite a while, and it doesn't seem like the government's cutting back really anywhere.
Well, Utah has actually cut a few fees. They've reduced some fees, even in the face of inflation. So, for example, in the business realm, they reduced the fee to file for a LLC or corporation from $70 down to $54. They are working to automate a number of processes. There's quite a few. They call them RFPs, requests for proposals, that the state's put out for new software systems that will reduce the number of workers needed, government workers and things. And so there are some efforts being made by the state government to cut costs, to become more efficient. Utah is actually they do a very good job in the government of being a very fast adopter of technology and trying to utilize it to improve things, in interacting with citizens and things. But from the perspective of spending, so this was even back when sales tax on service was an issue, because Utah was sitting on, I think, over $1 billion income tax surplus. And that's an issue for Utah, for the Utah legislators, because income tax at the time was restricted to use only for education. So they couldn't spend it on whatever they wanted. So they wanted to increase sales tax by imposing sales tax on way more things, lower income tax. And so essentially they want to say your net tax burden stays the same, but we're going to move money from one account, the income tax account, to the sales tax account where we can use it for anything. And they openly said, we have over $700 million of appropriation requests that we want to spend money on. So these are people up there petitioning them for things. And one of those things was in the news recently. KSL did an article on it where I guess there's I think the University of Utah has a tattoo removal machine that they're expensive, and it had broke. And so it hadn't been used for over a year. They didn't have money to fix it. But they provided tattoo removal for inmates and others trying to help them have a better shot at life after they get out of jail. And so they were petitioning for almost $200,000, I think, to fix the machine. And 200,000 compared to $1 billion surplus is a drop in the bucket. But there are just boatloads of requests like that made to the legislature every year, where groups are petitioning for money and funds. And so sometimes, so we have the two issues with taxes running concurrently. One is the government operating efficiently? Do they have too much burden within the government? Employees, workload, are they being efficient in things? And then we have the issue of how much the government's spending on whatever projects, societal projects. And from what I've seen, again, I actually kind of applaud Utah. I think they do a good job on the government operations side. I really think they try to be good employers, be good with the number of people they hire and work with. But on the appropriation side, where we as a public are asking for money, there's a lot of demands to the legislature. And there's a lot more money being paid out. And so that's a part where we as people, I think, need to say, what is appropriate government expenditure, what isn't? Because, while personally I think it's a really good thing to give criminals a second chance, I would actually love to have programs to help them remove tattoos, to help them reintegrate into society and things. But when you start down that path, where's the cutoff? How much is too much? How many machines do you need? How many people do you need running those, staffing those? It's kind of the same with mental health. We have a huge push right now in the government to provide more and more mental health services. But where do you draw the line? How much is enough to spend on something versus too much to spend on something? And when you open up the coffers for things like that, it's kind of a bottomless pit because there's incredible demand for the services. And so how do we, divvy that up? How do we decide on that? And it's the same with the legislature saying, oh, we're going to send $8,000 per year per kid to those that homeschool or private school. That's a lot of money being spent. And will people want more eventually? Probably. Will they want that to cover more people? Probably. And Frederick Bastiat, he wrote the book called The Law. And his opinion was that once you opened up the government coffers to social programs, he said there was no principle that stopped the spending. And it just became those who could clamor the loudest and petition the most to get funding. And the legislature certainly feels a lot of pressure from us, again, as people, for those funds. We all feel we have a worthy cause. If you ever go to a city council meeting, they have, I think it's at least once a year, they're tasked with appropriating federal funds that have been given. And their job is to do that. And at those city council meetings, there will be group after group, just long lines of people that say, we have the most worthy cause, give us part of the money. We have the most worthy cause, give us part of the money. And it's very interesting to watch because it's a very different type of feel than talking about rights and responsibilities. You're there, people petitioning, saying that their cause is the most worthy or whatnot. And so I'm not here to say that we shouldn't ever have any social program of any sort, because even the US Constitution has one it requires, which is we have to provide criminal defendants with legal representation. And that's, a social program that's put into place by the US Constitution. And that's one, again, where there's incredible demand. You know, how do we make the decision on how much we fund, how much we don't? They're important questions. And I think from the perspective of checks and balances that I like to talk about, we do need to have checks and balances in place. How much do we spend? How do we decide if we're going to venture into something? But we don't really have those discussions right now. Right now, it's just, are we going to give you money or not? Do you win the award or not? Do we feel bad enough for you or not? And that opens the place for lots of news stories, lots of, you know, emotional, hard-hitting stories about something bad that happened to someone to really pull at the heartstrings. And so a lot of political campaigns now involve a lot of stories and people impacted and hurt as they petition for these funds because they're trying to generate sympathy to get the funds. But I do agree that as a state, we should be very judicious in taxes and spending. But I think that's a bigger context we really need to talk about that within. And yes, with inflation, the government makes more money because when they charge a percent and the amount you spend goes up, your taxes went up too as products rise in price.
So wouldn't it make sense that if the inflation's going up, that maybe the percentage goes down?
If the goal, so for example, that kind of is supposed to happen with property taxes, where in theory, if your home value goes up, your amount's not supposed to go up. And that's a pure reading of the law that says that the percentage is supposed to go down as your home value increases. But what happens is, as your home value goes up every year, the groups vote to do a tax increase. And so virtually every year you have a tax increase that's coming into place to keep rate with that so that your taxes go up a little bit. And in our minds, we all think it's because our property values went up, but it's actually because they increased taxes that are owing. But yes, in theory, if we have a fixed sum that we need, then yeah, the sales tax percent should go down with inflation to reflect that. But it's not tied to that at all currently.
And it's obviously not happening.
No. No, and that will be a tough sell, I think, to get through the government to tell them they need less slush funds to play with. They like having that. But going to one that's a little bit fun to look at, because sometimes we talk about more serious things. This one's a fascinating one to me. What we do about flying cars and drones. So we have a bill that's been proposed. And it's proposing that the Department of Transportation start to study vertiport locations and infrastructure, you know, so takeoff locations, unmanned traffic management infrastructure, the creation of an advanced air mobility sandbox. The sandbox would be a place where people can get permitted to experiment with things. And so UPS, Amazon, they want to deliver packages via drones, for example. And Wayne Harper, the Senate sponsor, is saying, hey, Utah, it's about time we get on board and start making some plans for this. Now, in this bill, it's a little bit weak, or I should say a lot bit weak. You know, the first sentence, I always love laws like this that aren't really laws. The department shall, which means it's supposed to, it's mandatory, carry out transportation studies described in this section as resources allow. So technically, if resources don't allow, they'd never study it.
What bill is this?
This is SB 161. And then it says specifically, so we talk about as resources allow. The last line of that section says, the department may only use existing funds to cover the expenses incurred from the study of items. So in other words, they're saying, we don't want to put any tax money towards this, but hey, Department of Transportation, start to study these things. Start to talk about, you know, obtaining a full understanding of unmanned aircraft system traffic management, designating airspace for advanced air mobility, creating geographic categorical areas. So probably like freeways, you know. Do we want flying cars flying over homes, or do we require them to fly above streets? as an example. Because again, to me, these are some of the fun things about technology, is that this type of technology can literally change our entire way we've planned for, our lives. It's, should we make all flying vehicles fly above the freeway so that one never crashes into a house? Well, if so, we're taking a lot of, reduced time potential out of things. Because one of the benefits of flight is that you can get there in a straight line rather than following roads and other things like that are in place. But curious what your thoughts are on advanced air mobility, drones and flying cars and that fun stuff. Excuse me.
Does the FAA already have requirements on drones?
They have some.
And this is
Yeah.
adding to making more local rules and regulations, I guess.
Yeah, so for example, I doubt the FAA would say, would designate. So let's, if you go back to, I don't know, Star Wars movies, and you watch all their ships flying on a planet, they usually fly in lines, because they kind of have freeways that are established in the air, elevations, altitudes, all that kind of stuff. And if you're going north, you're in this corridor. If you're going south, you're in this corridor, kind of thing. And I would assume the FAA would permit states to designate those, kind of like they do currently. There may be a federal right of way through somewhere, kind of like a federal freeway. But the feds aren't going to come in and tell every city and town where a drone can or can't fly. But we have this issue with things like, again, Amazon air delivery. If they're going to have drones flying from their centers, do those drones all need to follow the roads? Or can they just fly over the homes, do the straightest shot, drop it off at the, doorstep and take back off? I doubt the FAA is going to step in on that specific detail.
So this bill is just to create a study on what would be best for these things, and it's not actually creating any laws regarding them.
Yeah, not yet. It's telling the department, you have to study this as resources permit. We want to be able to see some, things later.
Does anybody here know how close are we to really this being a reality?
It depends on how comfortable you are with the technology. If you go to Dubai, they have flying cars.
Really?
Dubai is one of the countries that have been the earliest adopters of it legally. And the US is getting some flack because they've been very hesitant to allow for flying vehicles. And so they're saying that all the technology is going outside the US currently to places that allow it. But it's a real thing. I actually worked with a guy a little bit that he has a dream of making $150,000 flying vehicle, making it available for people. And so some of it's a few years out. But if you just Google and do some internet searches on the types of flying vehicles and drones they have right now, it's intense. Amazon, UPS, they're actively testing drone delivery of packages.
So is Walmart.
Yeah, Walmart, all these big companies that can get it. I think the FAA is only given out a handful of permits to test it. But it's very much something that is happening in cities in America. People are getting drone deliveries. And so the question is, as a government again, what do we do? Do we just say, oh, free market, we'll let UPS decide how best to handle this? Or do we need to put some resources towards this? My personal opinion is we should put some resources towards it. It's here. We got to figure it out pretty quickly.
I saw a video today on a drone that could carry 500 pounds. They're working on. It's a big 13-foot long thing. And I mean, you talk about UPS and FedEx and Amazon. Right now, they're using the roads. They're constrained by the laws we have on, traffic. Imagine that this could get ugly. You could have things flying every which way. Who's going to monitor where these things fly? Who's going to manage that? You're going to have air patrol, police. I mean, it could be a really ugly thing to think. So it's probably good that we study it.
Yeah, I personally am. This is actually an area where I feel it's very necessary for government to be involved. I feel government has some very important functions in certain areas, and I think this is one, because we have buildings, we have people, we have safety, like you say, ugliness of just drones crashing in the air because everyone's going every which way, doing their own thing. Maybe they have sensors on them that help avoid that. Maybe they don't. I don't know. Obviously, the companies would have an incentive to not have drones crashing. That's not going to help them. So my bet is there's some safety features built in, but
Hey, you know what? Let Dubai, let
lead
them,
the way.
yeah, let that, I mean, let them take all the hard knocks and figure it out there. I mean, I don't know. Machines are never, I mean, obviously humans make mistakes, but I mean, if you have something remotely heavy falling out of the sky, or navigate, I just, to me, I mean, I guess technology can always be scary when you don't understand it, but I don't know. I'm grateful that America hasn't, just with reckless abandon brought it all in and has been cautious, because it seems like it could have some serious negative impacts the first several generations of these products.
Yeah, so this is something that America has traditionally been very wary of. We get very scared of new technology that could have bad impacts, and it could be a good thing. But if you study the history of the elevator in America, people were so afraid of elevators for so long. It was mandated by law that you had to have an employee in it that pushed the buttons for people, because they felt it made the elevator safer to have the employee there doing that. So if you see any of the old movies, there's always the elevator person that works there, that their job was literally to sit in the elevator and push buttons for people to take them up and down. And that helped people feel safe enough to utilize the elevator, till eventually those laws said, who we kidding? We got it figured out. Now, I've been stuck in an elevator. It's not to say the elevators work perfectly. I got in an elevator once with, I don't know, probably 12 other attorneys. So that was the first mistake. And, never get in an elevator full of attorneys. And it started moving, and then suddenly it dropped really quickly. The cord snapped or something. The emergency brakes caught, but there was this jolt as it dropped, and then we spent a half hour as those emergency brakes slowly lowered us down to the very bottom floor. And the air's turned off in there and all these things, and you're just sweating up a storm. And so, yes, safety is important. Again, I think this is an appropriate realm for government to be involved in. But when you go through and start thinking about all the complexities of air travel and pollution and, all the stuff that could happen with things falling out of the sky or whatnot, it's not hard to imagine where this could go. But again, if we embrace it and put in some really good safeguards, but allow people to test it, could we get far further, far faster? It's certainly part of the future. And so I think for me, this bill, looking at it, I like the idea of studying it. I like the idea of starting to propose models. But I would actually submit that I think this is something we should spend some money on. It's coming, it's happening. We can't sit by and pretend that someone else is going to solve the problem for us necessarily. I think our community should weigh in. I think that we should have public discussions and get public input, help people understand what may be happening. And I mean, there's even been some of the grand schemes for Amazons or UPSs. They actually want to have like a blimp-like hub that sits up that they launch that's full of packages, and then all the drones fly up to it and fly back out from it to deliver things, because the hub can kind of fly along, and then all the drones go out on the delivery pathways and things. And so again, things could look very different. And this is one where I kind of view it as fun. I kind of view it as, yeah, technology is always changing. You know, we have to decide what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And I'm a supporter of the government being involved in helping to manage that. So, are there any other bills or anything anyone wants to talk about quickly before we're done for the night? Or any comments on flying cars or drones? Maybe your homework should be to look up some of the videos. It's pretty amazing what they have.
I'd just love to get your what do you think, the vaccine passport, do you think it has a good chance of going all the way through?
Yeah, so HB 131 was in committee today, made it out of committee 3-2. I personally do think it has a good chance of going through. It's a bill similar to the school choice bill, where school choice came up last year, had a lot of issues. They had to work a year to get everyone on board with it. The vaccine passport bill, they spent a lot of time over the year, this last year, working on it to get whatever businesses had a concern about it, whatever employers had a concern about it. So it has a number of exceptions that still allow for vaccine requirements in it. And there's enough that it satisfies any business that had a concern or that was raising a voice. And so I think that it will pass. I don't think there's a lot of concern about whether it will pass or not with the current political climate.
I talked to Walt Brooks today, and that he's a sponsor of the bill, and he said that he's found that it takes 2 years to get a high-profile bill to have any chance of passing. That it takes the first year to get all the opposition out, and then the second year it slides right through most of the time. So he
Yeah,
says,
it's because people get very tired of fighting and they get demoralized and they just don't have the same energy the second year that they did the first year.
so yeah, we were just talking about how it was just, that meeting today was so different from last year. It was so contentious last year, and there was so much pressure last year. I mean, people were suffering, you know. Now the vaccine mandates have basically been lifted, so that pressure isn't there, but crazy what a difference a year can make.
It was very different, for sure. There was very little discussion on it, very little. You know, even Walt Brooks presenting on it was just, yep, here we are. We've resolved concerns. We're ready to vote on this kind of thing. And he didn't feel it necessary to really pitch it because, again, when you see that, you know that there's been a lot of work in the background for those things. And that does happen. So I guess one other one just to throw out really quickly, you guys can think about. In our state, we have this interesting notion of water ownership and water rights, and HB 349 gives authority to the state to deny your ability to reuse water. So if a corporation, for example, can take a bunch of water and then clean it up and reuse it, they can deny that if they feel that the water should go to the Great Salt Lake to help keep the Great Salt Lake elevated. And so it's one where, and maybe I don't understand everything about water, but it's an interesting one to me to say, well, if we're not allowed to reuse it, then we have to pull it from the dams, right? If whoever's going to be using it anyways is going to need the water. I don't know. So again, it was one where I went, are we really saving anything in the end? Is there any change overall? Or is that something the government should be allowed to ban us from doing from reusing water. For example, in Utah, it's often illegal to collect your own rainwater from your house because they want it to go to the Great Salt Lake. So those are areas you can think about with bills like HB 349 are the people collecting rainwater? Does that impact the Great Salt Lake? Does it not? Again, I don't know enough detail on what that would or wouldn't do. I don't know if anything that comes off my house is making it to the road anyways, because I think most of it's hitting the lawn and probably staying there. But these are some things to be aware of, that the government's looking for power to deny your ability to reuse water. So that we'll end there. That's again HB 349 you can look at. But think about air mobility, think about water, think about campaign signs. Form some opinions on it and reach out to a rep or senator. Let them know your thoughts on something. So we appreciate you guys joining tonight, and we'll plan to follow up next Tuesday when it starts the 5th week of the session. And we'll talk to y'all more then.
Thanks so much, Austin.
Thanks, Austin.
Thanks, guys.